It is such a pleasure and an honor to welcome Colson back to Politics and Prose for the 7th time. I know, right? He was previously here for The Intuitionist, John Henry Days, Zone 1, Sag Harbor, The Colossus of New York, and Apex Hides the Hurt. I hardly need to tell one person here about the explosive success of the Underground Railroad. As a bookseller, though, it's been interesting to watch. It is possible that sometimes, when a writer gets selected to be part of Oprah's book club, we may roll our eyes and dismiss it as a bunch of hype. Not this time. We are thrilled, because Colson is a novelist that everyone should read, must read. His diverse, exploratory body of work has clearly been building to the Underground Railroad, but nothing in his previous work can prepare you for the physical feeling you were left with after you finish reading it. One friend told me, I wanted to set everyone in the book that hurt Cora on fire. Then I wanted to set the book on fire. It forces us to confront our country's past, to look at how much things have changed and how very little they have changed, and to reckon with how much hate still exists in our country. The Underground Railroad is wrenching, and it is necessary right now. Please help me welcome Colson Whitehead to Politics and Prose.
Howdy do. It is really great to be back at Politics and Prose for the 7th time. It's crazy. So I first had the idea for the book, and thanks to all of you for coming out. It's really neat. So the book is called The Underground Railroad. I first had the idea 16 years ago. I came across a reference to it and remembered how when I was in 4th grade and first heard those evocative words, I envisioned a literal railroad beneath the earth, which is really impractical. But I thought, what if that, what if it actually was a literal track beneath the earth? And it seemed like a really cool idea, but I knew if I tried it back then, I would fuck it up. And so I decided not to do it. And maybe if I wrote some more books, I might become a better writer. If I had adventures like Hemingway and like fought a hobo or something, became more butch, I might be more wise about the earth and the world. Whenever I finished a book, I would go back to my notes and think, am I ready? And the answer was always no, until 2.5 years ago. And I had sold the book to my editor, and but I was having some doubts. So I decided to tell my wife about the Underground Railroad idea. And in a marriage, sometimes you have to make conversation, kill the silences. And so I told her, and she said, I don't want to say that your idea that you're doing right now about a Brooklyn writer going through a midlife crisis is dumb per se, but this Underground Railroad book sounds pretty good. So I was like, huh. And then I decided to tell my agent, who I'd been with for 18 years, and she said, well, both ideas sound good, which is not helpful. But then she emailed me on a Sunday, which she never does, and said, I can't stop thinking about that new idea you have. So that was 2. And then Wednesday came around. Wednesday is shrink day. And so I told her, and she said, what, are you crazy? I mean, we both know you're crazy, but this book sounds really up your alley. And I just left my editor, and he's the head of Doubleday, and he just said, giddy up, motherfucker, which is publishing speak for, I think that's a very good idea and we should pursue it. So I did. And in this section, Cora is on her home plantation in Georgia, and it's old Jockey's birthday. Jockey is the oldest slave in the plantation, and whenever he senses a need for release, he declares that it's his birthday. It could be once a year, twice a year, and there's food and dancing and music, and they celebrate life in the midst of this hell. The plantation is owned by James and Terrence Randall. There's a reference to Caesar. Caesar is a new addition to the plantation. He was raised on a small family farm in Virginia and was promised that he'd be set free when his owner died. But his owner's heirs had different ideas, and he was sold down south with his parents and the furniture and the other property that she had. And he never sees him again and ends up on Randall. And he's the one that approaches Cora about the Underground Railroad. And then finally there's Chester, who's a 10-year-old boy, and Cora has taken him under her wing as a protector. The music stopped, the circle broke. Sometimes a slave will be lost in a brief eddy of liberation, in a sway of a sudden reverie among the furrows, or while untangling the mysteries of an early morning dream. In the middle of a song on a warm Sunday night. Then it comes, always, the overseer's cry, the call to work, the shadow of the master, the reminder that she's only a human being for a tiny moment across the eternity of her servitude. The Randall brothers had emerged from the great house and were among them. The slaves stepped aside, making calculations of what distance represented the right proportion of fear and respect. Godfrey, James's houseboy, held up a lantern. According to old Jockey, James favored the mother, stout as a barrel and just as firm in countenance. And Terence took after the father, tall and owl-faced, perpetually on the verge of swooping down on prey. In addition to the land, they inherited their father's tailor, who arrived once a week in his rickety carriage with his samples of linen and cotton. The brothers dressed alike when they were children and continued to do so into manhood. Their white trousers and shirts were as clean as the laundry girl's hands could make them, and the orange glow made the men look like ghosts emerging from the dark. Master James, Jockey said. His good hand gripped the arm of his chair as if to rise. Master Terence. Don't let us disturb you, Terence said. My brother and I were discussing business and heard the music. I told him, now that is the most god-awful racket I've ever heard. The Randalls were drinking wine out of goblets of cut glass and looked as if they'd drained a few bottles. Cora searched for Caesar's face in the crowd. She didn't find him. He hadn't been present the last time the brothers appeared together on the northern half of the plantation. You did well to remember the different lessons of those occasions. Something always happened when the Randalls ventured into the quarter. Sooner or later, a new thing coming that you couldn't predict until it was upon you. James left the daily operations to his man Connolly and rarely visited. He might grant a tour to a visitor, a distinguished neighbor or curious planter from another neck of the woods, but it was rare. James rarely addressed his niggers, who'd been taught by the lash to keep working and ignore his presence. When Terence appeared on his brother's half of the plantation, he usually appraised each slave and made a note of which men were the most able and which women the most appealing. Content to leer at his brother's women, he grazed heartily upon the women of his own half. I like to taste my plums, Terence said, prowling the rows of cabins to see what struck his fancy. He violated the bonds of affection, sometimes visiting slaves on their wedding night to show the husband the proper way to discharge his marital duty. He tasted his plums and broke the skin and left his mark. It was accepted that James was of a different orientation. To hear his valet Prideful tell it, James confined his erotic energies to specialized rooms in a New Orleans establishment. The madam was broad-minded and modern, adept in the trajectories of human desire. Prideful's stories were hard to believe, despite assurances that he'd received his reports from the staff of the place, with whom he'd grown close over the years. After all, what kind of white man would willingly submit to the whip? Terence scratched his cane in the dirt. It had been his father's cane, topped with a silver wolf's head. Many remembered its bite on their flesh. Terence said, Then I recollected James telling me about a nigger he had down here, could recite the Declaration of Independence. I can't bring myself to believe him. I thought perhaps tonight he can show me, since everyone is out and about, from the sound of it. We'll settle it, his brother said. Where is that boy, Michael? No one said anything. Godfrey waved the lantern around pathetically. Moses was the boss unfortunate enough to stand closest to the Randall brothers. He cleared his throat. Michael dead, Master James. Michael, the slave in question, had indeed possessed the ability to recite long passages. According to Connolly, who heard it from the nigger trader, Michael's former master was fascinated by the abilities of South American parrots and reasoned that if a bird could be taught limericks, a slave might be taught to remember as well. Merely glancing at the size of their skulls told you that a nigger possessed a bigger brain than a bird. Michael had been the son of his master's coachman, had a brand of animal cleverness, the kind you see in pigs sometimes. The master and his unlikely pupil started with simple rhymes and short passages from popular British versifiers. They went slow over the words the nigger didn't understand, and if truth be told, the master only half understood. But they made miracles, the tobacco farmer and the coachman's son. The Declaration of Independence was their masterpiece. Michael's ability never amounted to more than a parlor trick, delighting visitors before the discussion turned, as it always did, to the diminished faculties of niggers. His owner grew bored and sold the boy south. By the time Michael got to Randall, some torture or punishment had addled his senses. He was a mediocre worker. He complained of noises and black spells that blotted his memory. In exasperation, Connolly beat out what little brains he had left. It was a scourging that Michael was not intended to survive, and it achieved its purpose. I should have been told, James said, his displeasure plain. Michael's recitation had been a novel diversion the 2 times he trotted the nigger out for guests. Terence liked to tease his brother. James, he said, you need to keep better track of your property. Don't meddle. Terence continued. I knew you let your slaves have revels, but I had no idea they were so extravagant. Are you trying to make me look bad? James's glass was empty. He said, Don't pretend you care what a nigger thinks about you, Terence. He turned to go. Oh, one more song, James. These sounds have grown on me. George and Wesley, the musicians, were forlorn. Noble and his tambourine were nowhere to be seen. James pressed his lips into a slit. He gestured, and the men started playing. Terence tapped his cane. His face sank as he took in the crowd. You're not going to dance? I have to insist. You and you and you. They didn't wait for their master's signal. The slaves of the northern half converged on the alley, haltingly, trying to insinuate themselves into their previous rhythm and put on a show. Putting on a show for master was a familiar skill. The small advantages and angles of the mask, and they shook off their fear as they settled into the performance. Oh, how they capered and hollered, shouted and hopped. Certainly this was the most lively song they'd ever heard, the musicians, the most accomplished players the colored race had to offer. Cora dragged herself into the circle, checking the Randall brothers' reactions on every turn, like everyone else. Jockey tumbled his hands in his lap to keep time, and Cora found Caesar's face. He stood in the shadow of the kitchen, his expression flat. Then he withdrew. You! It was Terence. He held his hand before him as if it were covered in some eternal stain that only he could see. Then Cora caught sight of it. The single drop of red wine staining the cuff of his lovely white shirt. Chester, the boy, had bumped him. Chester simpered and bowed before the white man. Sorry, master, sorry, master. The cane crashed across his shoulder and head again and again. The boy screamed and shrank to the dirt as the blows continued. Terence's arm rose and fell. James looked tired. One drop. A feeling settled over Cora. She had not been under its spell in years, since she brought the hatchet down on Blake's doghouse and sent the splinters into the air. She'd seen men hung from trees and left for buzzards and crows, women carved open to the bones and left open to the bones with the cat-o'-nine tails, feet cut off to prevent escape, and hands cut off to stop theft. She'd seen boys and girls younger than this beaten and had done nothing. This night, the feeling settled on her heart again. It grabbed hold of her, and before the slave part of her caught up with the human part of her. She was bent over the boy's body as a shield. She held the cane in her hand like a swamp man handling a snake and saw the ornament at its tip. The silver wolf bared its silver teeth. Then the cane was out of her hand. It came down on her head. It crashed down again, and this time the silver teeth ripped across her eyes and her blood splattered the dirt. Thank you. Jonathan, how do you do?
That was amazing. So again, I'm Jonathan Wilson. I am the afternoon host of WAMU 88.5. I want to say, first of all, thanks so much to the staff here at Politics and Prose for having us here. Just a little bit about the station. I'm sure a lot of you already know this, but we really think that curiosity and community is what our station is all about, and we think that's what local independent bookstores are all about. So this is a really amazing partnership for us. We've also put a new focus on storytelling at WAMU, and of course that has a lot to do with everything that Politics and Prose is about. We have a couple staffers in the room from WAMU. I don't know if any of you guys can raise your hands. So if you want to talk more about the station, anything at all, a few of us are around. If you are tweeting tonight, please use WAMU Books as your hashtag. We'd like that. And if you want to know more, you can always keep in touch with us at wamu.org/books. And yeah, that says it. When I first picked up my copy of this book a couple months ago, I was really excited, but I was skeptical. I am, as you may or may not be able to tell, half African American. So this book has, the subject matter of this book has some special resonance for me, as it does undoubtedly for many of you. Perhaps just as importantly, I'm an American literature major, Middlebury College anyway. And anytime a new American novel is hyped, fairly or unfairly, as a shattering, powerful meditation on the history we all share. That's from the jacket copy, by the way. I can't help but say to myself, this better be good. Well, as many of you undoubtedly know, this book is better than good, at least in my humble opinion, and it really is exciting to be able to talk to you, Colson. So you've talked a bit about this, but in your introduction, but when you first started writing this book, did you feel any of that extra pressure or even hesitation, taking on a topic that comes with so many baked-in preconceptions? You obviously had a pretty ingenious conceit, but when you have a subject like slavery, the Underground Railroad, that has so many impressive literary forebears, maybe not enough, but some really impressive ones out there, Toni Morrison comes to mind. What did that do to you as a writer?
Well, I mean, I always try. All books are hard, and so each one is just difficult in its own way, and you try to figure out the solution that gets you into it. With this book, I did put it off for 16 years because I didn't want to delve into the history of slavery and do that kind of research, very disturbing research. And definitely, even when I committed to it and kept reading and reading more slave narratives, it was incredibly depressing. So I put it off for those reasons. And then in terms of the subject being written about so much, I did read, I did pick up Beloved. I hadn't read the book in 30 years, and I hadn't read The Known World by Edward Jones in 14 years. And sometimes you want to read people who've done the same thing, sometimes you don't. And it had been so long that I didn't remember that much about the books, so I was like, oh, well, I can do it. And I read 30 pages of Toni Morrison, and I was just like, I'm pretty fucking screwed. Toni Morrison is, a goddamn genius. But no matter what you're writing about, whether it's slavery or war or romance or family or childhood, I guess what has got me through this kind of moments, somebody probably smarter and more talented than you has already tackled the subject. All you can do is hope that you have something individual to add to the conversation. I think, and that's true whether you're writing journalism or a memoir or anything. I think you have to believe that you have something to say, even though many people have done it better and done it before you. I
imagine there are a few maybe fledgling writers in the room that might be curious about this. In terms of your actual workflow, how you write a book, I imagine that every book is a little bit different, but you clearly realized there was something different about this book or something different about this idea that other people around you recognized as well. Did that make your workflow different about the way, the times of day that you decided to write, how long you spent outlining, the actual technique of your writing?
Yeah, I mean, I always, I'm sort of nerdy, so I always do a lot of outlining before. Have to know the beginning and the end, and the middle can be fuzzy. But it seems that it's hard enough to find the right words each day. If you don't actually know what's going to happen, it seems twice as hard. So each day when I get up, I'm going to introduce Ridgway, the slave catcher. I'm going to describe Homer, his sidekick, and I have a mission. And then in terms, for the last couple of books, just because it is a marathon, writing a novel, and it takes a long time. If I can do 8 pages a week, that seems pretty reasonable. I can't, I have kids. I can't always have a full day of work. If I have a doctor's appointment at 1, I'm like, oh, why start? Everything's so terrible. So that day is shot. So it could be 4 days or 3 days, and depending, it could be Monday and Tuesday, and then Sunday, or Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday. But if I get 8 pages, it's an accumulation. 8 pages a week is 400 pages. That's like a novel. If you do 4 a week, that's 2 years. That's, a novel. So I'm always just trying to, in most things in my life, I'm just trying to get through them with the least amount of horror. And so if I have a finish line, it works for me.
Do you edit as you go? I mean, how does it work for you?
Yeah, there's some days when I don't feel like writing, and that's usually an editing day. And so I'm always like, if I write 5 pages, the next day I'm stuck, I might just revise pages 2, 3, and 4. And I'm always going forward and backward. So I never really got the whole draft system. It was like, how many drafts do you do? And it's like, I'm always just going forward and backward the whole time. And I write in notebooks, I write on a computer, editing, on printouts is always really great.
All right, so let's talk about the quite literal Underground Railroad in this novel. Slate's book critic, Laura Miller, described the railroad in your novel as part New York subway and part nightmare theme park conveyance, each stop providing another tableau illustrating the barbarity of white supremacy. Another thing that struck me about your vision of the Underground Railroad is that it literally freed up space for you to talk about the emotional part of an escape from slavery. You didn't have to spend time talking about the mechanics of which houses, Cora had to go to, or as much anyway. It simplified things. That choice, talk about the choice and what it did for you and why you felt like it really made sense for your book to do it like that.
No, I mean, it was a choice baked in from the beginning. My first idea was that it's a literal railroad. But then it freed me from history. I mean, spoiler alert, there's no literal railroad. So I'm already not sticking to the facts. And I guess my overriding theory was that I won't stick to the facts, but I'll stick to the truth. And so so once I added the complicating element where each state that Cora goes through is a different state of American possibility, like Gulliver's Travels. Each state has its own culture of what America might have been or different paths we've taken. It allowed me to move history around in a way I couldn't do if I was doing a straight historical novel. And then in terms of going back to the idea of waiting and how the railroad works, I think 10 years ago, the fantastic effects would have been much broader. For many years, South Carolina took place in the future, and black folks were being bred in eugenics experiments, and it was more obviously fantastic. And then a novel that was helpful to reread was 100 Years of Solitude, and I started thinking, well, what if I didn't have my fantastic effects cranked up to a Spinal Tapian 11, but just had them sort of down to a simmering 1. And so now everything takes place in 1850. That's the cutoff for slang and technology. And everything that's strange and that happens is in a deadpan sort of style, and Cora accepts it. And so I think 10 years ago I would spend 10 pages describing the tunnel and how it works. The tunnel here is really a doorway, a threshold, just getting us to the next section. And I think and taking off that burden of explaining things was helpful. If you watch Star Trek: The Next Generation. They spend a lot of time explaining how Data doesn't know how people work. And so it's like, what's wrong, Commander Riker? It's like, it's a tear. A tear. Accessing. And, like Google and Siri are faster than Data. A salty discharge from the eyes symbolizing sadness or happiness, So if I took out that kind of over-explaining element, I could just get right to the meat and potatoes of these different states. So using fantasy, fantastic effects in a different way than I usually do.
All right, as a big fan of Star Trek: The Next Generation and Colson Whitehead, he just made my day. So, for many reviewers, this novel, I think, you've written quite a few books, and I think, very few reviewers doubted your ability. And yet, it seemed to a lot of reviewers that this novel came as a bit of surprise. Julian Lucas, a reviewer in the New York Review of Books, says plainly, Colson Whitehead isn't the first person you'd expect to write the Underground Railroad. Other critics have written that many of your novels have been marked by a sense of irony and wit. You yourself have admitted to sometimes falling back to a stock, ironic black man protagonist. Cora, the protagonist of this novel, is certainly not your stock, ironic black man. So where did Cora come from, and why was she important, to make her the way she is in the novel?
Sure. I mean, in terms of tone, my last book was like a humor book about the World Series of Poker, and I knew that that kind of humor and satirical distance wouldn't work for this. So immediately, I knew it was going to be a different book. And then I'd had 3 very ruminative narrators in a row, so I wanted to get away from that. And then one of the first slave narratives I read in college was the story of Harriet Jacobs, who wrote a famous slave narrative, runs away and hides in an attic for 7 years in North Carolina until she can get passage out of her town. And so there's something that always stayed with me. She says early in the book that 14 is the start of the worst time in a slave girl's life. Now you're a woman and you're sexual prey for your masters, for other slaves, and you're supposed to pump out babies, because more babies means more people to pick more cotton's more money, more slaves to sell, and it's the specific horror of the female slave experience seemed worth tackling and exploring, and since Harriet Jacobs was one of the first narratives I read, it seemed to salute that. And then I think that's about right.
Yeah. Okay, I've got one more question for you before we get to all of your questions, which I'm sure will be even better than mine. So some people may not know this, but before your first novel, if I'm not mistaken, you were a TV critic for The Village Voice. We are in the midst of what many call a golden age of television. So I wonder, this is a 2-part question, what are you watching these days? And I also should note there have been a couple of shows. WGN's Underground is a drama that maybe many people haven't heard of, but it's about escaped slaves or people who are trying to escape. And there was a remake of Roots that also dropped this year. Both have garnered positive reviews. So what are you watching, and are you interested in what TV as a medium has to say about this subject that you're writing about right now?
Yeah, in terms of Underground and Roots, I DVR'd Roots, and I was like, I'm still kind of slavoried out. I just finished this book in December. I can't just go back into that again. And I'm probably going to see something that's like a historical detail I fucked up. So I haven't watched them. I watched it one day. And then, in terms of what I'm watching, I was a TV critic like 20-something years ago. And back then it was like the job that no one wanted. Like now TV's cool. Back then, like, it was really a degrading experience. The way people, you say I'm a TV critic, like I don't even own a TV. So I'm excited for Westworld. Peaky Blinders on Netflix is really good. The Americans, probably best cable show. Looking forward to. I was sick last week, and I binge watched Vice Principals, which I guess I just watch that dude's comedies every couple of years, and when I'm like, he's so crazy. But it's nice being just a consumer and not having to have different theories about stuff. So I like being a consumer, not a critic anymore.
Do you get asked to write any TV criticism these days?
Not in a long time.
Yeah. All right. Well, now it's time to get to your questions. I think we can just have people step up to the mics, and yeah, there's one here and one there. Yeah.
Who's first?
Okay.
Me first?
You first, Elmer.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here and finally get a chance to meet the guy who wrote this book. Cora's experiences, is bad. But my question to you is, what made you choose the right-of-way for the railroad? I mean, why'd you choose South Carolina, North Carolina, Tennessee, Indiana? How'd you get there?
Unfortunately, it's totally random. It could have been started in Florida and been Georgia, and for years it's like, don't want to go in a more Midwestern route. Don't want to go up the Atlantic coast, and really, I mean, the alternative states are. South Carolina has nothing really to do with South Carolina, and so all the states are really random.
One of my Saturday club. We've spent some time with this book.
Mm-hmm.
One of my colleagues found a South Carolina experience in terms of the experiments with slave women and the medical experiments, and it looked just like what's in your book.
Yeah, I mean, there were different sterilization periods in American history. I'm not sure how many were in South Carolina, but they were all over.
Yeah.
The Tuskegee syphilis experiment didn't take place in South Carolina, and I sort of moved it up there. So, I didn't feel bound to the actual history of every state, and a lot of times when there's there's a big famous brush fire in Tennessee, it was really sort of coincidental that I picked Tennessee to have the brush fire state.
One last thing. Sunday, there was an article in the Post about Lyle Station, Indiana. Sounds just like, the experience there. Same time, same place.
Yeah, no, it was really just, for many years, it was just like Black Utopia. And then it could have been, it could have been Indiana or Illinois when I finally settled down, so. Randall. How'd you do?
I have a very unfair question. About 10 years ago, I read a fascinating book about the Underground Railroad in Pennsylvania, which focused on the role of Amish quilts being hung out to dry as messages for people who were using the Underground Railroad. Would you happen to know what it was? And if not, I recommend it to you or everybody else to do a web search because it shouldn't be too hard to find.
I don't know that book, and perhaps a web search would reveal the identity of this mystery book.
Pennsylvania Railroad Amish quilts.
All right, some good keywords. Let's go, team.
I just wanted to say thanks for coming and speaking with us tonight. You talked a bit about your approach as a writer to elements of the fantastic. And as a former critic and as a writer, I was wondering if maybe you had some thoughts or reflections on what seems to be a broader acceptance or welcoming of fantastic elements or genre fiction. I'm thinking of your works of Zone 1, The Underground Railroad. I'm thinking of 11/22/63 by Stephen King, and a contemporary of your work now, which is Underground Airlines by Ben Winters.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I went through that with Zone 1, like, why is a literary author talking about zombies? And the debate has always been really dumb. I mean, I started writing because I loved Marvel Comics, late 70s, Marv Wolfman, Amazing Spider-Man, Chris Claremont, the classic runs, and Stephen King. And so when I first wanted to start writing, it was fantasy stuff I wanted to write. And Beloved has a ghost. Plot Against America, Philip Roth, alternative history, usually domain of sci-fi. So I'm surprised that people I'm surprised that people are surprised that so-called literary authors cross over. If you write 10 books. I mean, hopefully you're varying your approach and trying different things. And so defending genre from literary people or whatever just seems like the whole discussion seems tired. I think, it seems very natural to me. So.
No, I agree. And thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Hi, Mr. Whitehead. Thanks for coming here. I was just thinking about what you were saying, how you felt you weren't ready at the time to explore your idea. I think it's kind of ironic because I saw a lot of parallels, I believe, between this book and The Intuitionist. I hadn't read Zone 1, but it's the only novel of yours I hadn't read. And like I said, I saw a lot of parallels between the protagonists as well as the fantastical elements. So I was just wondering if you could talk about that for a bit.
Sure. I mean, I think I wasn't as I think controlled enough to really write the book 16 years ago. And there are definitely elements in common in terms of talking about race and American history, a female protagonist. But I think in describing the tone and the fantastic effects and how the different character of each section would have been much different if I'd started it 16 years ago. And I'm really glad I waited. And I'm older, wiser. I think I'm better at building characters, and I think that's definitely has made Cora into the not person, because she's not a person, but thing on the page, and work the way that she does. So, thank you.
Thank you.
I was just curious, did you are the characters in the book based on people you did research on, or the names in the book people you did research on, or are they just sort of composites?
Not based on anybody. I mean, Harry Jacobs inspired the North Carolina section. Cora, when she's trapped in North Carolina, has to hide in an attic until she can get out. But besides that, not really. I mean, I think later on there are people who borrow the rhetoric of Booker T. Washington and Du Bois and Frederick Douglass.
Yes.
But then a lot of the names are really just random. If I see my friend, Chuck on Tuesday, and I need a character name on Wednesday, I'm like, Chuck, the villain of the piece, So.
Yeah. All right. Thanks.
Thank you. I am a fan of WMU and a supporter too, but because of Tom Sherwood and Kojo Nnamdi.
Well, there are
Yeah,
a lot,
we'll have to
you're in
listen
good
to
company.
you.
There are a lot of people who are fans
listen
of those
to
guys.
you as well. Thank you so much for writing this book. And it has a different meaning for me because I am a descendant of people who were enslaved on maternal side and paternal side. And I'm curious as to whether or not you've done any ancestral research, because even though it may be a novel, many of the incidents are very, very real. And in real terms, some even more horrible than what you depicted in your book. So that's the question. Have you done any ancestral research? Have you been to the new Museum of African American History and Culture?
Yeah, I haven't been to the museum yet. Just opened, and hope when the tour ties down, I can come back and spend the proper time with it. In terms of, I guess people have asked if I had a new curiosity about my family, and the answer is no. It's never really occurred to me. I know, my father wasn't close to his family. I know his mother came from Barbados, which is a big sugar plantation.
Plantation, yes. A lot of history about the sugar plantations.
And his father came from Florida, sort of half black, half Seminole, supposedly. And my mother's family, one line can be traced back to some free men and free women who owned taverns in Virginia for a long time. And so in interviews, I've been like, I don't know that much.
Do you know what part of Virginia? I am a genealogist, and my people hail from Culpeper, by the way.
And Culpeper, yeah.
Yes, on paternal side, okay.
So Madden family, I don't know if you know the Maddens, but that's...
No, the names, and some of the names you used are all through, through the, charts and history and stuff. And then my final question is the snake incident. I don't want to...
Okay. Thank you. It's towards the end
No,
of the book.
I'm not going to give a spoiler. I just want to know, am I to take that literally, or where
yeah,
did that come from?
I can't
or
discuss.
is it symbolic?
Can't
okay.
discuss.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. I'll talk to you when I get you to
Thanks.
sign
Yeah,
the
thanks so
book.
much for your questions.
Okay, all right.
Well, I too want to thank you for writing this book, which is terrific. And I guess, without trying to spoil anything, also Ridgway. Where does he come from today, or does he come from then? Because I was struck on page 75 about the patrols and about how you expressed him stopping people and the pleasure he got out of stopping people. And I wondered whether that was modern or back then.
So the question is about Ridgway, the slave catcher, and I was hoping to make a proper villain to stand up to Cora, who's a proper hero. So in doing the research, I'm making parallels between the past and the present, but it wasn't particularly hard. If you just read the description of the slave patrollers in any slave narrative, it's an identical description of stop and frisk. And so before there was a real police force, the slave patrols would ransack plantations, homes of free men and black women after runaways, and if you were caught in the streets as a black person, you had to deliver your papers and show that you had the proper ID to be out in the street. And so you don't have to push the language very hard to make a direct
Sounds familiar.
comparison. So there are a lot of things that sort of came up like that in the research. And I would say that our current severe problem with police brutality and law enforcement's attitude towards the black body does date back to slavery times.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. My question actually is about Ridgway too, but if we're not allowed to do spoiler alerts, then I can't really ask you about a choice you made in the middle of the book. Is that right?
Yeah,
no
you
spoiler
can.
alerts?
Yeah.
All right, I'll find you later.
All right, that's good.
Hi. So I guess I had a couple questions, but I think the one that I'm really curious about is if you would talk a little about your hopes for this book, or if you were curious, like if you kind of knew what kind of impact you were hoping to make, or maybe it was unexpected, but just
Yeah,
about
I
that.
wasn't hoping to do anything. I hope, when I'm done with the book, I hope it's good. I assume it's good. I'm done with it. And, I think they're all pretty good books. And, but when I wrote the first 100 pages, gave to my wife and my agent and editor, and just the way they were sort of talking about it, I was like, this is new. Like, I don't know what's going on. I hope I don't fuck up the next 200 pages. And then I handed it in and started going to booksellers and just to give them an advanced peek, and they started talking about people read my previous books, but were talking about this book in a different way. There's something in their voice. And so I sort of knew that I had hit upon something different with this book. And then really, every step of the way, it's been really different and great. And the last 7 weeks have been the most sustained happiness I've ever had. Like, I'm in a really good mood all the time. I think about death or Donald Trump, and I'm like, so I'm not sure how long it's going to last. But so far, it's been pretty good.
Oh, can I ask a quick follow-up as well? I was curious if you had a sense or some inklings of what you'd like to do next, or if you just need to recover and sleep for a while.
Yeah, I'm not going to do anything until the spring when I'm recharging. And I have a book that's maybe about New York in the 1960s. So.
Hi. I teach literature, and I brought my students, they're all around the room, from the University of D.C. We've been reading your book for the last 3 weeks, and we've really studied it carefully. It's been very exciting for all of us. And I'm wondering about your characterization, how you have shaped all of these different characters, men and women, slave and free person, white, black, old, young. They are tenacious and pernicious all at the same time. And I'm wondering how you are all of these people and how you have drawn them so deeply and so broadly in this book.
Well, thanks. And thanks for teaching the book and spreading the word. it is your job. I've definitely gotten better at it, hopefully book to book. If you keep at something, whether you're a dentist or a teacher or a writer, if you keep sticking at it, hopefully you get better at it. So I think definitely, I think I was in the groove with this book. But, I'm drawing from myself, from people I know, using empathy, imagination. I think in terms of the different kinds of personalities in the book. Ridgway is a villain, but what makes him tick? His reality, his philosophy makes sense to him, and so you have to find a language that makes it credible. Mm-hmm. And if he's convincing himself, and can I convince the reader of the rightness of his philosophy, even though it's completely wrong. In terms of the different kinds of people in their attitude towards slavery, obviously there are slave masters who are cruel and invested in the system in a certain kind of way. There are abolitionists and Underground Railroad station workers who are helping. And there's I always think of Ethel, who is married to an abolitionist, Underground Railroad worker. And she, I think, is like most people, just doesn't actually care, in the same way that we're not necessarily thinking about pockets of poverty and homelessness in our own towns every day. We're just trying to get through and put food on the table and live our lives. Some people just didn't give a shit about slavery and didn't have any opinion about people being enslaved. And so how can, over the course of the book and different states, depict these different attitudes towards slavery and different ways of being American and being a slave. And so because the book is being rebooted every 60 pages, I do have this opportunity to get a much bigger cast than I normally would.
Mm-hmm. It's fascinating. Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, thank you for coming. I'm not sure I'm ready to read this book. It's from the segment that you read. It's it's going to cause some nightmares, and I don't know if I can live with it day after day. I may have to go to read something, some other original older books or whatever. Is there any reason I should attack yours with all of its power, or should I read Toni Morrison and slave narratives?
Well, I wouldn't call Beloved really uplifting. It's about slavery, and it's not like Scarlett O'Hara is being self-actualized over the course of her life. That's the nature of the material. So if it sounds compelling, you should read it, and if it doesn't, you're in a bookstore with a lot of other stuff to read. So, thanks.
Hello. I wanted to ask you, I don't think this will intrude on the book, someone who hasn't read the book, but as you, the writer, said a few minutes ago, something you knew where you were going when you finally began. How about the choice of your narrative voice as well as Cora's, which is a different thing altogether? Because that is one of the things, I'm on my way through the second time now, and I'm particularly noticing voice. And I just wonder if you could say anything about that.
No, sure, yeah, thanks for the question. The question is about the voice of the narrator and Cora's voice. It was very hard to do the research, and the only thing to do was to start writing, and I wrote the section with Cora's grandmother, Ajari, and that voice came really quickly, immediately, and basically became the dominating voice in the book. Usually it takes me a while, like 100 pages or 60 pages to get the voice, and I have to go back and retrofit all the early pages. But the matter-of-fact tone, I think, came from slave narratives in the 1930s, or oral accounts of former slaves, more properly. In the 1930s, the U.S. government sent out writers to interview former slaves, people who had been kids or teenagers at the time of the Civil War. And they were just, talking about their lives in 2 paragraphs or 6 pages, and would say things like, my mother was beaten to death, and then my sister was sold off the next morning, and I was finally old enough to work in the fields. And it's like 2 sentences, but a whole life is there, and there is such distance because they are talking about it from 60 years later. But to compress so much brutal personal history in this matter-of-fact tone made it even more sort of terrible. And so in the first section, before we get into the more fantastic bits, I wanted to be realistic to the experience of slavery, and that means a lot of violence. In terms of Cora, she starts off uneducated, an object on the plantation, no agency, and hopefully as she goes from state to state and broadens her view of herself and the world. She is thinking about who she is and what freedom means, and I'm picking enough different situations so that she can interact with history and other people and grow from object to person, state to state.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The New York Times Sunday edition published an excerpt from the book, which they described as being sort of a composite, I guess. I wondered if you had a role in the editing of that piece that appeared in the Times.
To the New York Times, newspapers declining in circulation, so they're trying to find different things that they can do to make subscribing great. So it wasn't digital. It was like a pull-out section, an excerpt.
It was only available if you bought the Sunday Times.
Right. So they're trying to find different ways that they can make buying the paper special in the way that it sort of used to be. And so they're going to run fiction twice a year, and mine was the first one. They wanted 1,600 words, and it was a lot. And so how do you get Cora in? And so we, an editor who I worked with before did it one pass, and I changed things. So it was a collaboration, but really at that point I had so much, the book was about to come out, and I was just like, you guys just go, sometimes you have it in it, and sometimes you don't have the energy. So.
Well, they did a good job.
They did a great job, yeah.
Did you, in getting this decision after 16 years to finally write this book, did the fact of President Obama's, the country's experience, did that sort of accelerate or have any effect on you getting to that place?
In what way?
I don't know. I mean, the country is sort of, in some ways, more aware, and maybe in other ways not so much of its race problem. And I was sort of wondering whether that, sort of bore on your, like, holy shit, I got to write this book now.
No, not so much. I mean, America's a pretty racist country, has been for centuries, will continue to be so for a while.
Yeah. I heard that, yeah.
Yeah. Sort of my interpretation of history and my personal experience. So my idea of slow racial progress is definitely baked into this book and other books. If you just listen to sort of campaign coverage, you can see how much of the furious racist energies I talk about in the book have been harnessed in the last 9 months. Yeah. So I guess the short answer is not really.
Yeah. Thanks.
So, thanks.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Thank you so much, Colson. We're very grateful that you were here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz.